People don't listen because you talk louder. They don't listen because your ideas are brilliant. And they definitely don't listen just because you're right. They listen because of how you make them feel. They listen because they see themselves in what you're saying. And they listen because your words bypass their defenses and go straight to the part of the brain that whispers, "This is for me." There's a moment in every conversation when attention either expands or collapses, when curiosity flickers into focus or turns off completely. And the difference between being ignored and being magnetic often comes down to 3 words. 3 deceptively simple words that flip a switch in the human brain. A linguistic trick that pulls people in, even when they don't know why. You've heard these words before. You've probably used them without thinking. But today, you're going to see exactly why they work, how they trigger ancient social wiring, and how to use them intentionally, ethically, to become more persuasive, more memorable, and more trusted. Let's start with a truth most people ignore. Human attention is not logical. It's emotional, it's biological, and it's rapidly shrinking. The average person sees over 10,000 marketing messages per day. We scroll, we skim, we swipe, we don't read, we glance, we don't listen. We scan for threats, novelty, or relevance. And what do most people do when trying to get someone's attention? They make it about themselves. Let me tell you what I think. Here's my opinion. This is what I believe. But here's the catch. Nobody cares. At least not yet. Because before someone listens to you, they subconsciously ask themselves one thing. What does this have to do with me? And this is where the magic begins. There's a tiny phrase that flips the spotlight, that takes the focus off of you and puts it directly on your listener. It instantly answers their unspoken question. It pulls them in by making them the center of the story. That phrase? You know how. That's it. 3 words. You know how. At first glance, it sounds like casual filler, like something you'd say before telling a story. But in reality, it's one of the most psychologically powerful sentence openers you can use, because it triggers recognition. It activates mirror neurons, and it primes the brain for shared experience. When you say, you know how, you're not delivering information. You're inviting agreement. You're creating a bridge between your mind and theirs. Let's look at how it works. Imagine I start a conversation by saying, you know how you sometimes walk into a room and forget why you're there? Your brain lights up. You nod, you smile, you feel seen. Now I've got your attention. Not because I'm interesting, but because I've made you feel understood. That's the key. You know how lets the listener fill in the blanks. It hands them the mental pen. And as soon as they say yes, even silently, they're with you. It's a pattern interrupt, a conversational reset. It softens skepticism and opens the gate for whatever comes next. Now compare that to the usual way people speak. Let me tell you something about memory lapses. See the difference? One pulls you in, the other pushes you away. This 3-word opener works because of a psychological principle called involuntary agreement. When someone hears you know how, they're subconsciously compelled to nod, whether they agree or not. It activates mental simulation. They start scanning their own experience for a match. And when they find one, you've just formed a connection, not a logical one, an emotional one. That's what persuasion is built on. Think about some of the most persuasive people you've met. They rarely start with data. They rarely lead with I think. They lead with relatability. They create alignment before they present ideas. You know how it feels when... You know how people always... You know how frustrating it is when... These phrases do something that raw facts can't. They bypass resistance. They short-circuit the part of the brain that's constantly evaluating, judging, dismissing. Because you're not asking them to accept a new idea. You're asking them to recognize a shared experience. And that's powerful. Because once someone nods, physically or mentally, they're no longer neutral. They're with you. They've become participants in the conversation, not just passive listeners. And here's where it gets even more interesting. You know how doesn't just work in casual conversation. It works in pitches, in speeches, in copywriting, in leadership. You can use it to start a TED Talk. You can use it to open a sales call. You can use it in a social media caption, a YouTube hook, or a therapy session. Because it does the one thing most messages fail to do. It creates instant relevance. When you use you know how, You don't have to prove that your idea matters. You've shown it already, through emotional resonance. You're not selling, you're connecting. Let me give you a few examples. You know how people always try to remember names, but forget them 5 seconds later? You know how hard it is to stay focused when you've got 47 tabs open? You know how sometimes you feel overwhelmed before the day even starts? Each of these opens a loop. Each of these invites a yes. Each of these makes you want to know what comes next. And once someone says yes in their mind, they're far more likely to agree with whatever follows. This is known as the yes ladder. It's a well-documented persuasion technique used in sales and behavioral psychology. Small agreements lead to bigger ones, and it all starts with getting that first mental yes. You know how is the doorway to that first yes. It makes your message feel familiar. It makes your tone feel safe, and it makes your audience feel like they're not being talked at, but talked with. Even better, it works in writing too, especially in formats where attention is scarce. Think email subject lines, tweet hooks, ad copy. You know how people never read the terms and conditions? Boom. You're curious. You're engaged, because even if you don't personally do that thing, your brain is already simulating the idea. That's mirror neuron magic. You're seeing yourself in the message, which means your guard goes down. Let's zoom out for a second. Why do these 3 words work so consistently across so many contexts? It's because they tap into something primal, the human desire to feel understood. Before we trust, before we listen, before we change, we need to feel like someone gets us. You know how signals that. It's a linguistic handshake, a non-verbal nod, a whisper that says, you and me, we see the same world. In a noisy world, that signal cuts through. And yet, it's not about manipulation. It's not about tricking someone into agreeing. It's about showing that you've taken the time to understand their world before asking them to understand yours. That's ethical influence. That's real persuasion. That's communication that lasts. So the next time you want someone to listen, whether it's one person, a room full of people, or 1,000 strangers scrolling past, don't start with facts. Don't start with logic. Start with those 3 magic words. You know how. You know how sometimes you hear a phrase once and then start noticing it everywhere? That's what happens with you know how, once you understand its power. Suddenly it's in every viral video, every stand-up routine, every compelling ad, every conversation where someone is truly connecting. But what's really happening is deeper than a phrase. It's a strategy, a pattern, a rhythm, one that adapts itself depending on how and where you're communicating. Let's start with presentations. Whether you're speaking in front of a group or just trying to get buy-in during a Zoom call, the hardest part isn't explaining your idea, it's getting people to care. Most presentations open with data, credentials, or objectives. And while those may seem important, they don't hook attention. They don't anchor you emotionally. Now imagine opening a presentation with this instead. You know how sometimes we feel like we're constantly busy, but never actually getting anything done? Heads nod, people smile. You've just described the collective tension in the room. Before showing them the solution, you've made them feel seen. And from there, anything you share will land deeper. It's not just information anymore, it's resolution. In marketing, it's even more crucial. When attention spans are measured in milliseconds, you don't have time to explain why your product matters. You have to make someone feel like it's already part of their life. The moment they hear it, they should be nodding. That's what you know how does. It skips the rational pitch and dives straight into emotional alignment. You know how your headphones always tangle the moment you put them in your bag? You know how you never remember your best ideas when you're in the shower? You know how hard it is to stay awake during boring Zoom meetings? These are not product descriptions. They're mirror reflections, and that reflection earns attention. Now, let's bring it into leadership. The best leaders aren't the ones who give the most directives. They're the ones who create buy-in. And that doesn't start with telling people what to do. It starts with validating what they already feel. You know how overwhelming it's been since the team restructure? You know how confusing that last software update made things? You know how frustrating it is to work hard and still feel behind? Each of these opens a door. It shows empathy before expectation. It lets your team know, I see it too. And that single moment of acknowledgement often carries more weight than a full report. Even in storytelling, it changes everything. Most stories don't connect because they're too focused on the teller. But stories that start with you know how invite the listener into the memory. They blur the line between narrator and audience. You know how your heart races before a big decision, even when everything looks fine on paper. You know how some smells instantly take you back to childhood. You know how it feels when you think you've lost everything and then something unexpected happens. Those aren't just openings, they're time machines. They transport you, not because of the words themselves, but because of the emotional context they create. And this brings us to another layer, body language. Because persuasion isn't just about words, it's about delivery. When you say you know how, you don't shout it. You lean in, you slow down, you invite instead of broadcast. It's the conversational equivalent of lowering your voice to draw someone closer. Your tone softens, your eyebrows rise slightly, your body language says we're in this together. The pacing matters too. You don't rush through the phrase, you let it breathe. You know how there are days when everything feels heavy. That pause, that tiny moment of stillness, is where connection happens. It gives your listener space to reflect, to access a memory, to feel. Now let's take it into digital content. Social media, YouTube, short-form videos, all spaces where grabbing attention instantly is make or break. The you-know-how structure is a cheat code here, because it's familiar, it's conversational, and it breaks through the noise of polished scripts and generic intros. Imagine a YouTube video that opens with, you know how you rehearse conversations in your head and then say nothing when the moment comes? You're hooked. You want to hear more, because you feel like it was written for you. That's what we call psychological specificity. It's not just a general question, it's your question. And once you hear it, it's almost impossible not to keep listening. Now, let's explore the neuroscience behind why this works. When someone hears you know how, their brain enters a state called semantic priming. It begins scanning for related memories and emotional associations. This isn't a passive process, it's active simulation. The brain literally recreates the experience being described. This activates the default mode network, the part of the brain involved in self-referential thought and empathy. In short, it puts the listener inside the story. And when they're inside the story, they're far more receptive to what comes next. But there's more. Because you know how also triggers a sense of social proof. When someone hears that phrase, their brain interprets it as other people feel this too. And in moments of uncertainty or curiosity, that's powerful. It reduces resistance, it lowers cognitive load, and it opens the door for belief. This is why it's so often used in viral storytelling. On platforms like TikTok, for example, videos that open with you know how consistently outperform those that don't, because they immediately frame the content as shared experience, not instruction. And let's not forget humor. You know how is one of the most common setups in comedy, and for good reason. It creates instant identification. You know how your phone always dies right when you're about to show someone something important? You know how autocorrect ruins your life at least once a week? You know how everyone suddenly forgets how to drive when it rains? Each of these gets a laugh. Not because it's shocking, but because it's true. Humor is rooted in recognition, in surprise layered on top of familiarity. And these three words are the perfect gateway. But even outside of humor, it works because it's non-threatening. There's no demand in you know how. There's no pressure, no sales pitch, just an opening. A window, an invitation. It's like saying, let's walk through this idea together. And when people feel invited instead of coerced, they show up more fully. They engage more deeply. They listen longer. Now let's shift gears slightly. Because while you know how is powerful, it's even more effective when paired with the right follow-up. After you've opened the loop with a shared experience, the key is to deliver value, to bridge that emotional connection with something insightful, helpful, or transformational. You don't want to say, you know how hard it is to stay organized, and then nothing. You want to follow with, that's why I started using this one simple system, and everything changed. This is called bridge messaging. It's where you move from resonance to relevance, from emotion to solution. And here's the formula. You know how, shared frustration, or that's why, solution or insight that resolves it. This structure is insanely effective in content, in copywriting, in sales calls, even in coaching or therapy. You know how starting your day feels chaotic? That's why I designed a 3-minute ritual that grounds me before anything else happens. You know how you start doubting yourself when you're too quiet in a room? That's why I remind myself, silence isn't weakness, it's processing. You know how you forget what you were doing halfway through your to-do list? That's why I batch my tasks into focused sprints, and suddenly everything flows. Each of these examples follows the same emotional rhythm. They don't just name a problem, they resolve it. They take you from recognition to transformation in under 15 seconds. And in a world starved for clarity, that's a superpower. Because people aren't just looking for answers, they're looking for resonance first, then guidance, then a path. And these 3 words, you know how, are the compass. They guide your audience back to themselves. They hold up a mirror. They say, yes, you're not alone. And that moment of connection, that flicker of alignment, is where true influence begins. Into understanding how people listen, the more you realize that listening isn't just about sound, it's about safety. People listen when they feel emotionally safe, when they don't feel judged, cornered, or sold to. And you know how works because it signals something very rare in communication. Non-judgmental alignment. You're not telling someone what they should feel. You're reflecting what they already feel. And the moment someone feels seen without being corrected, their guard drops. Their curiosity rises, and now they're open. Think about how most conversations go wrong. They're filled with actually, and let me explain why you're wrong. But conversations that go right, conversations that change people, almost always start with yes, I know what you mean. You know how is the shortcut to that yes. But here's where the mastery begins. Once you've established that emotional connection, once you've created a moment of yes, that's me, what you do next determines whether that attention deepens or disappears. This is where timing and delivery matter more than content. Say too much too soon, and you overwhelm them. Say too little, and you lose momentum. Speak too fast, and it feels scripted. Speak too slowly, and it feels like a lecture. So you pace it, you breathe, you give space between your statements. Because influence isn't in the speed, it's in the space. That space is where people have time to feel something, to reflect, to respond internally before you continue. You know how works best when what follows isn't rushed. It's not a TED Talk, it's not a debate. It's a conversation where the person listening feels like they're walking with you, not being pulled behind you. And the more natural it feels, the more impactful it becomes. You might be wondering, can something this simple really work in high-stakes settings? In professional conversations, in leadership meetings or performance reviews? Yes, especially there. Imagine a manager sitting down with an employee and saying, you know how sometimes feedback can feel personal, even when it's not meant to be. That moment alone reshapes the entire conversation. Instead of putting the employee on the defensive, it puts them in a shared experience. It sets the stage for openness. Or a doctor saying, you know how it's hard to stay motivated when the changes don't show immediate results? Now the patient doesn't feel shamed, they feel understood. Or a teacher telling a student, you know how some concepts just don't click the first time you hear them? That student just breathed a little easier. This phrase disarms pressure. It humanizes authority. It neutralizes fear. And when you reduce fear, listening skyrockets. Let's take it into customer service or client communication. You might have data, you might have the perfect solution, but unless the person you're talking to feels heard, none of it lands. Start with, you know how frustrating it is when you expect a package and it just doesn't arrive. You've just created empathy. Now your explanation won't feel like a policy script, it'll feel like support. This isn't about being clever, it's about being real. You know how works because it's rooted in truth, and not your truth, theirs. It requires you to step into the other person's shoes and feel what they might be feeling. That effort alone makes your words more powerful. It's not manipulation, it's connection. and connection is the currency of influence. Let's zoom in on storytelling again, because one of the most overlooked uses of you-know-how is setting context without exposition. Writers, content creators, podcasters, everyone benefits from this. Instead of spending 30 seconds explaining a setting or situation, you use this phrase to drop the audience into it. You know how the air feels before a storm? Instantly, we're there. You know how it feels when you're the last one to leave the office? We can hear the silence. You know how your heart starts racing when your phone rings unexpectedly? We're feeling it. This is immersion without explanation. It works because people don't need the whole backstory. They just need the anchor. A single sensory emotional cue is enough to pull them into the world you're creating. It's like emotional shorthand. And here's where it becomes even more potent. Pair it with contrast. You know how you can feel totally calm, and then one sentence ruins your whole day? You know how everything can be fine until you check your email? You know how you promise yourself it's only one episode and then the sun is coming up? This is what we call tension pairing. You start with something familiar, then introduce the twist. This creates engagement through conflict, one of the most ancient storytelling techniques, and you can use it in so many formats. Podcast intros, email marketing, social captions, Instagram reels, YouTube shorts, even product launches. Because every piece of content, no matter how short, needs a moment of "yes, that's me." Without it, you're guessing. You're hoping someone will care. But when you use you-know-how strategically, you're not guessing anymore. You're inviting. Let's shift again, this time into personal relationships. Because we often think of persuasion as something public, something professional. But the most powerful use of this phrase is often in the most private moments. You know how sometimes you want to say something, but you don't know if it'll come out right? You know how it feels when someone tries to fix it instead of just listening? You know how scary it is to admit you're struggling? These are not just conversation starters. They're bridges, they're olive branches. They're gentle ways of opening hard doors. They show that you're not just there to speak, you're there to understand. And in love, in friendship, in family, that's everything. So if you've ever struggled to get someone to open up, or to share something difficult without pushing them away, this is a phrase to keep close. Let's not forget negotiation. In high-pressure situations, business deals, legal conversations, even parenting, framing matters more than logic. You know how it feels when someone keeps changing the goalposts. You know how frustrating it is to work hard and not be recognized. You know how people just want things to be fair. Now you're not negotiating against someone. You're aligning with them, and from that place, agreements are easier. Compromise feels collaborative instead of forced. This phrase doesn't change your values. It doesn't make you weak. It makes you effective because it creates shared ground. You're not shouting across a river. You're meeting on a bridge. Let's go even more granular now, because this isn't just about what to say. It's about how to say it. The delivery of you-know-how should feel like a side note, not a headline. It's almost like a secret you're letting someone in on, like you're sharing something soft, something personal, something real. And when you deliver it that way, low pressure, almost under your breath, it feels intimate, like a whisper in a crowded room. That contrast is what grabs attention. Everyone else is shouting facts, you're whispering truth. Everyone else is pitching, you're connecting. Everyone else is trying to impress, you're trying to understand. And the human brain knows the difference. Let's finish this section with a challenge. Over the next 24 hours, notice when people tune in and when they tune out. Watch their faces, watch their eyes, listen for when they lean in and when they lean away. Then try it. Next time you want to be heard by anyone for anything, start with those 3 words. You know how, and watch what happens. You know how sometimes people talk, and they're technically saying all the right things, but no one's really listening. Not because the content is wrong, but because the connection isn't there. That's what happens when we forget the emotional blueprint of communication. Because beneath every conversation, every pitch, every post, every meeting, there's one question bouncing around in the listener's mind. Why should I care? The mistake most people make is assuming they have the answer to that question. So they lead with features, they lead with logic, they lead with facts. But the truth is, the only person who can answer that question is the listener. You know how hands that power back to them. It turns your message from a monologue into a mirror. It makes your words reflect their world. Let's talk about how to layer this into your long-form storytelling. Suppose you're telling a personal story on a podcast, maybe something about failure or transformation. You could begin with, so back in 2019 I lost my job and everything felt uncertain. Or you could say, you know how sometimes everything feels fine until one email changes everything. And now the listener isn't just hearing your story, they're feeling their own. When you combine you know how with emotional pacing, you give your story lift. You create rhythm. You're building tension and release, a natural wave that mirrors the emotional journey of your audience. Even better, it makes your story feel universal. It's no longer about your specific situation, it's about our shared experience. That's how individual truth becomes collective resonance. Now let's talk about leadership communication, especially in moments of change, stress, or uncertainty. Most people in leadership roles are trained to present solutions. That's fine when people already trust you. But when they're scared, frustrated, or burned out, leading with solutions feels tone deaf. That's when acknowledgement matters more than instruction. You know how it's hard to stay motivated when priorities keep shifting? You know how exhausting it is to give your best and still feel behind? You know how hard it is to speak up when no one seems to be listening? These statements don't solve anything on their own, but they change the tone, they shift the emotional weather, and from that place, real dialogue can begin. And that's what this whole strategy is about, creating the emotional conditions for real dialogue. That's what makes people listen, not volume, not complexity, not even charisma. Safety, resonance, alignment. You know how people crave clarity but don't want to be talked down to? That's the sweet spot. Speak with them, not at them. That's what you know how helps you do. Now let's take a look at some scenarios where using this phrase can completely reframe a message. Imagine you're trying to introduce a new idea at work. You could say, here's what I think we should do. But that often gets met with silence, resistance, shrugs. Now try this. You know how we've been putting out fires every week but never getting ahead? And suddenly everyone's paying attention. Why? Because now the idea isn't yours. It's theirs. You're not bringing a new plan. You're continuing their story. Or imagine you're trying to repair a relationship. You've been distant. There's tension. You could say, I've been going through stuff. And that's fine. But now try this. You know how sometimes your brain just gets loud and messy, and it's hard to let people in? Suddenly you're not explaining, you're revealing. You're not asking for forgiveness, you're offering understanding. Now imagine you're teaching something, a coach, a mentor, a teacher. You could say, today we're learning about time management. But you could also say, you know how some days just seem to vanish before you get anything done. Now the lesson has meaning before it even begins. And that makes all the difference. So what makes these examples work? It's not the words alone. It's what they unlock. They open a channel in the listener's mind that says, this matters to me. Not because you said it well, because they felt it first. And here's something to remember. When someone feels something before they understand it, their resistance disappears. The logic becomes a support structure, not a battering ram. You know how sometimes you're halfway through explaining something and you can already feel the other person checking out? That's because the emotional link never got established. There was no spark, no mirror, no shared experience. But start with you know how. And suddenly, they're leaning in. Let's take it even further. In conflict resolution, the biggest barrier isn't disagreement. It's emotional defensiveness. People dig into positions because they feel unseen. But acknowledgement is the pressure release. You know how it feels when your ideas don't seem to land? You know how frustrating it is when the same issues keep repeating? You know how sometimes it feels like no one's really listening? These aren't admissions of guilt. They're expressions of empathy, and they invite the same in return. In parenting, it's the same. You know how hard it is to stay focused when there's a lot going on? You know how sometimes you just want to be left alone? You know how rules can feel annoying even when they make sense? You're not lecturing, you're aligning. You're showing them that you get it, even if you don't agree. That alignment creates trust, and trust is the soil where growth happens. Even in content creation, YouTube, podcasting, social captions, this approach builds engagement before you've even delivered value. It primes the brain to want more, not because the topic is interesting, but because the feeling is familiar. People will stay for insight, but they show up for resonance. Let's go micro again. Even in your personal journaling or self-reflection, this phrase has power. You know how some days you feel fine, but kind of off? You know how hard it is to start something even when you know it'll help? You know how sometimes you forget how far you've come? These aren't just rhetorical devices. They're entry points to deeper awareness. You can use them to unlock stories inside yourself, not just others. You know how sometimes you feel disconnected from your own voice? This brings it back. It's a way to listen to yourself while you're speaking, to reflect while you're expressing. Let's finish this segment by looking at how you know how can become a practice, not just a technique. Think of it like a lens you can put on before any important communication. Before you speak, ask yourself, what does this person already know but hasn't heard reflected yet? What experience can I tap into that's theirs, not mine? Where's the overlap in our emotional landscapes? Then say it, gently, honestly, without performance, and watch the shift. Because when people hear themselves in your words, they listen, they lean in, they stay. Not because you're persuasive, but because they feel connected. That's the real power of these 3 words, and it's always been that way.